Teresa Romano had become invisible long before she turned 39. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a slow fade, like a photograph left too long in the sun, the colors draining away until only the outline remained. She lived in a 3-story brownstone in Boston's North End, the same neighborhood where she'd been born, where her mother had taught her to make pasta from scratch, where she'd learned that family was everything. Now, that same family treated her like a piece of furniture they'd inherited and never bothered to replace. The wrinkles around her eyes told a story no one asked to hear. They were etched there from nights spent helping her sister's daughters with homework, from mornings waking at 5 to prepare their lunches, from afternoons standing in the kitchen making their favorite meals when their mother, her younger sister Angela, had fallen ill. It was cancer, swift and merciless, and Teresa was 28 when it took her sister away, leaving behind 2 girls who needed someone. She had stepped into that void without hesitation, without complaint. That was 11 years ago. She had sacrificed the dating years, the possibility of building something of her own, the chance to be someone's first choice rather than someone's obligation. Her friends from high school had moved on. They'd married, had children, built lives in suburbs with white picket fences. They sent Christmas cards with photos of themselves aging gracefully, always smiling, always surrounded by proof of their worth. Teresa received those cards and placed them on her mantle like medals of a life she hadn't lived. But she had done her job well. She had raised Maria and Lucia with tenderness, with the kind of quiet dedication that shaped them into young women of grace. They were beautiful, not just physically, but in the way they carried themselves, in the kindness they showed to others. Or so Teresa had thought. Time had a way of rewriting history. Success, it seemed, had a way of erasing gratitude. The brownstone was quiet on this particular October evening. Outside, the New England autumn was painting the world in shades of amber and rust, but Teresa barely noticed. She was upstairs in her modest bedroom, standing before an old mirror with a gilt frame, examining her reflection with the clinical eye of someone who had stopped expecting to like what she saw. Her dress was simple, navy blue, elegant in its simplicity, with a white pearl button near the collar. It was the nicest thing she owned, purchased 5 years ago for a church function. She'd worn it only twice since. Her hair, still mostly dark brown with threads of silver beginning to weave through it, was pulled back in a neat style her mother had taught her. Her face was lined, yes, but not unkindly. Her eyes were still bright, gray-green, intelligent, holding the kind of depth that only came from a life spent listening to others. But that was the problem, wasn't it? She had spent so long listening that she had forgotten how to be heard. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, embossed on thick, cream-colored cardstock. A family dinner in Naples. Maria and Lucia had both moved. Maria to Manhattan, Lucia to Miami. They had married men with money, men who worked in finance and real estate, men who spoke in abbreviations and measured their lives in portfolio returns. These men had taken her nieces away to a world of cocktail parties and charity galas, a world where Teresa visited occasionally and never quite fit. But this dinner was different. This was family. This was being invited home. Even if home had changed beyond recognition, she had hesitated before accepting. There was always a tension in those gatherings now, a brittleness beneath the surface that hadn't existed before. But Maria had called her personally, her voice warm on the phone, insisting that her aunt had to be there. It would mean so much to her, to both of them. So Teresa had packed this dress, driven to Logan Airport and boarded a flight to Rome, then made her way to Naples. She had done it all quietly, without fanfare, the way she did most things. She had always been the kind of woman who moved through the world like a shadow, present but unobtrusive. The restaurant was called Paradiso, located in the historic center of Naples, housed in a palazzo that had once belonged to a Bourbon prince. The dining room was all soaring ceilings and frescoed walls, with windows that opened onto the Piazza San Domenico Maggiore. The October evening was cool and the city lights were beginning to twinkle like stars that had fallen to earth. Chandeliers cast a golden glow across the room, and the air smelled of expensive perfume, aged wine, and anticipation. Teresa arrived early, as she always did. Punctuality was something her mother had instilled in her. It was a sign of respect, of reliability, of character. She sat at the table that had been reserved, her hands folded in her lap, and watched as the room began to fill with the beautiful people who had become her nieces. Maria arrived first, radiant in a dress that probably cost more than Teresa's monthly rent. She swept past her aunt with a kiss on the cheek, the kind of greeting that acknowledged presence but invited no real connection. Her husband, Robert, followed close behind, a man with slicked-back hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He shook Teresa's hand as though sealing a business deal. Lucia arrived shortly after, accompanied by her own husband, Christopher, who was marginally warmer but no less distant. The two couples occupied the seats at the head and foot of the table, while Teresa found herself positioned in a chair that was slightly farther away, separated from the main current of conversation. The evening unfolded with a kind of choreography that Teresa had come to recognize. Courses arrived: sea urchin, handmade pasta, fish that had been caught that very morning. Wine glasses were refilled. The conversation flowed around topics that were familiar to everyone except her: investment portfolios, vacation homes, the names of people she had never met and would never encounter again. She ate quietly, participating when directly addressed, observing the rest of the time. It was during the main course that she first noticed the shift. Maria and Lucia had positioned their chairs closer together, excluding their husbands momentarily from their conversation. Teresa watched as her younger niece leaned toward Maria, their heads nearly touching, their voices dropping to that particular register reserved for shared secrets and private jokes. She saw them glance in her direction, and she saw the smile that flickered across Maria's face. Not the warm smile of recognition, but something else, something that made her stomach tighten. The laugh that followed was just loud enough for Teresa to hear, but not so loud as to be directed explicitly at her. It was the laugh of people who thought they were being subtle, who had never quite understood the difference between discretion and cruelty. Teresa set down her fork. She had lost her appetite. The conversation at the table continued around her, indifferent to her distress. She was accustomed to this, the sensation of being a background figure in her own family's story. She had made peace with it years ago, or so she had told herself. But there was something about the way her nieces had exchanged that glance that felt different, something that suggested her presence was not merely overlooked, but actively ridiculed. She looked down at her navy dress, suddenly aware of how dated it must appear in this room of contemporary elegance. She thought about the life that had led to this moment, the years of sacrifice, the dreams deferred, the slow accumulation of choices that had left her here, alone at a table surrounded by family who barely saw her as human. The dessert course arrived, but Teresa barely tasted it. It was then that she heard Lucia's voice, just slightly too loud, breaking away from a conversation with her husband. There was a performance quality to it, a deliberateness that suggested she wanted to be heard. The words hung in the air like poison. Do you ever wonder what happened to people like her? I mean, what is she now? 50? 60? Still living alone in that old house, wearing the same dress to every event? There was a pause, pregnant with meaning. I suppose some people just weren't meant for more. The word pathetic wasn't spoken aloud, but it didn't need to be. It hung there in the space between them, written across the evening like a verdict. Maria's laughter joined Lucia's, and even the husbands smiled, the tolerant smiles of men who didn't quite understand the cruelty of women, but understood well enough to recognize that their wives were enjoying themselves. Teresa's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. She didn't drink it. She simply held it, needing something to occupy her hands, something to give her the appearance of being composed, of being fine, of being someone who could weather this storm of casual mockery without drowning. She looked out the window at the Naples night, at the city where her ancestors had lived, at the streets that held generations of her family's history. She thought about her mother, who had always said that character was something you built through kindness, through faithfulness, through showing up for people even when it cost you something. Her mother had taught her that the measure of a life was not in what you accumulated or achieved, but in how you loved. But love, it seemed, was not enough. It was not currency in this new world her nieces inhabited. It was not something that could be exchanged for respect or recognition or basic human dignity. The evening continued. More wine was poured. More conversation flowed around her like water around a stone. And Teresa sat in her navy dress, invisible once more, feeling the weight of her own insignificance settle over her like dust. She did not know, as she sat there in that palazzo in Naples, that her life was about to change in a way that would echo through all the rooms of her existence. She did not know that the evening was not yet over, that the cruelest part of the night had not yet arrived, and neither had salvation. She could not have imagined that the doors of the restaurant would open, and with them would come something that would remake the entire trajectory of her story. All she knew was that she was tired, and she was alone. The evening had reached that particular moment when the energy of a dinner party begins to shift, when people have eaten enough, drunk enough, and the initial excitement of the gathering has begun to curdle into something else. The conversations were growing louder, more boisterous. Someone had ordered grappa, and the mood was beginning to take on the quality of a private celebration, a closing of ranks among those who belonged. Teresa had excused herself to the restroom about an hour earlier, and when she returned, she found that her presence had been barely noticed. The table had rearranged itself slightly in her absence, and her seat had somehow become even more peripheral. She sat down and picked at the remains of her dessert, watching the evening unfold as though she were observing it from behind glass. It was close to 10 o'clock when the doors to the dining room opened. The thing about violence, or more precisely about the presence of those who conducted violence, was that it created a disturbance in the air itself. Animals could sense it. Children could sense it. Even civilized people, people who had never experienced true danger, could sense it. There was a moment when the room seemed to hold its breath, when every conversation didn't so much pause as fracture, when awareness rippled outward like a stone dropped into still water. The man who entered was not unusually tall, though he was tall. He was not unusually handsome, though he was handsome in the way that men who possessed absolute power often are. His face had been shaped by decision-making, by the weight of authority, by the certain knowledge that people would do what he wanted, because they understood what happened when they didn't. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Teresa's car, and his dark eyes moved across the room with the casual assessment of someone surveying territory that belonged to him. He was not alone. Two men flanked him, their bodies positioned in that particular way that suggested they existed in relation to him, not as independent entities. These were men whose primary function was to be useful in specific contexts. The owner of the restaurant appeared almost immediately. His face transformed into the expression of someone who had received an unexpected but not unwelcome visit from a superior being. There was an exchange that Teresa couldn't quite hear, though she noticed the restaurant owner gesturing toward a private dining room, toward options, toward accommodation of some kind. But the man didn't take what was being offered. Instead, he stood at the threshold of the main dining room, his gaze moving slowly across the tables, across the faces, across the evening that had been interrupted by his presence. Robert, Maria's husband, had gone very pale. Teresa noticed this with a clarity that seemed to amplify every other detail of the moment. The way his hand had frozen halfway to his water glass, the way his eyes had locked on the newcomer with the kind of recognition that suggested fear, not the ordinary fear of social awkwardness or unexpected confrontation, but something deeper, something more fundamental. The man's gaze continued its journey across the room, seemingly without purpose or direction, but there was a quality to it that suggested it was not random, that he was looking for something, someone. His eyes passed over the tables of tourists, the couples on dates, the businessmen conducting their evening negotiations, and then his eyes fell on their table. Specifically, they fell on Teresa. For a moment, and it was only a moment, though it seemed to expand and contract in a way that distorted time itself, the two of them were the only people in the room. Everything else became secondary, peripheral, less real. His dark eyes met her gray-green ones, and something passed between them that Teresa could not name. It was not recognition exactly. It was not knowledge. It was something stranger and more profound than either of those things. And then he moved. He walked across the dining room with a kind of measured grace, with the certainty of someone whose path through the world was always clear. His men remained at the door. The restaurant owner seemed to understand that he was not meant to follow. Everyone in the room seemed to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented, though no one could have articulated what that something was. He stopped at their table. His eyes moved to Robert, and Robert seemed to shrink backward. His gaze touched on Maria and Lucia, and both women had gone very still, their previous mockery replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. And then he looked back at Teresa. "You," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a kind of weight that made everyone listen. "Would you walk with me?" It was not a question, though it was phrased as one. It was a request that carried the force of an absolute command, though no threat had been made. And in that moment, Teresa understood something that had been building all evening, all her life. She had been waiting for something without knowing it. She had been moving through her days as though there was a missing piece that might someday arrive to make the picture complete. She stood up from the table. Her nieces gasped audibly. Robert had gone even paler, if such a thing were possible. But Teresa found that she was no longer thinking about them, no longer thinking about the mockery, the dismissal, the small cruelties that had accumulated like dust. She was thinking only about the fact that someone had seen her. Someone had walked into a room full of people and had seen her. He took her hand, not aggressively but gently. She noticed that his hand was warm, that his grip was secure but not crushing, that there was something about his touch that seemed to suggest both great power being carefully constrained and a kind of intimacy that she had never experienced before. He led her away from the table, away from the shocked silence that had settled over the dining room, toward the entrance of the restaurant. The October evening embraced them as they stepped outside. The temperature had dropped since the sun had set, and Teresa realized that she had no coat, that she was wearing only her navy dress. Before she could shiver, he had removed his suit jacket and draped it around her shoulders. The fabric was still warm from his body, and it smelled of expensive cologne and something else, something that smelled like safety, though she couldn't explain why. They walked out into the Piazza San Domenico Maggiore, away from the lights spilling out of the restaurant windows, into the quieter parts of the square. The night was alive with the sounds of Naples, distant traffic, the occasional laugh from other restaurants, the constant hum of a city that never quite slept. He had not released her hand. "What is your name?" he asked. His English was accented, his phrasing precise. He spoke as someone who had learned language not from classroom instruction but from necessity, from moving through the world and acquiring tools where he needed them. "Teresa," she said. Her voice sounded small to her own ears, but he didn't seem to notice. "Teresa Romano." He nodded as though the information confirmed something he had already known. "I am Vincenzo Moretti," he said. There was a pause, and in that pause was the understanding that this name meant something, that it carried weight in certain contexts. He was offering her the information and the opportunity to be afraid, if she chose to be. But Teresa found that she was not afraid. She was something else entirely, though she couldn't name it. "How did you know to—" she began, but he held up his free hand. "I will explain," he said, "but not here. Not now. Right now, I want you to know only this. The words they said about you, inside that restaurant, were the words of people who are small in ways that have nothing to do with their bodies or their bank accounts. The world has not forgotten you, Teresa Romano. The world simply has not yet understood your value." He paused, and she saw him looking at her with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing the details of her face, the exact shade of her eyes, the way her hair fell across her shoulders. "I am going to do something," he continued, "that will require your trust. And I understand that trust is something earned, something built over time, but I am asking you to give it to me anyway. Can you do that?" Teresa thought about her evening, about the way her nieces had laughed at her, about the slow accumulation of being unseen. She thought about the life she had lived in service to others, in the hope that love was enough, that showing up was enough, that quiet goodness had value in the world. She looked at this man, Vincenzo Moretti, and she understood that he was offering her something. She did not yet understand what, but she understood that it was being offered. "Yes," she said, and she meant it. The night unfolded in a way that seemed to exist outside of time, outside of the normal rules that governed how events arranged themselves into narrative. Vincenzo walked with her through the streets of Naples, his jacket still around her shoulders, his hand still holding hers. They didn't speak much. There was no need. The city spoke for them, the ancient streets and the modern lights, the layers of history that existed in every corner. He told her pieces of his story, in the way that people sometimes do when they have decided that honesty is the best currency. He was from Naples, born to a family that existed in the spaces between legitimate and illegitimate, in the gray areas where organized crime and local business intersected. He had been groomed for a particular kind of power since childhood, prepared for leadership in a world that operated by rules that were never written down, but were understood nonetheless. But something had changed in him over the years. He had watched people around him live and die according to the logic of that world, had watched families destroyed, had watched the accumulation of power create nothing but emptiness. And somewhere, in the midst of all that darkness, He had begun to wonder what it might be like to be someone else, to want something different. He had become what people called a businessman, which was true if somewhat incomplete. He had legitimate investments in restaurants and hotels, in real estate and hospitality. These businesses served as the face of his actual interests, which remained more shadowy and less legal. But increasingly, he spent his time on the legitimate side of his empire, moving away from the darkness, building something that didn't require the kind of moral compromise that had shaped his life. And then, he said, looking at her with those dark eyes, he had walked into that restaurant tonight. I was supposed to meet someone, he told her as they sat on a bench overlooking the city. A business associate, but when I walked in I saw you, and everything else stopped mattering. Teresa didn't ask him to explain further. She understood that he was telling her something true, and that the truth of it lay not in its rationality, but in its conviction. She had spent so long being overlooked that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen. But this man was seeing her, not the version of her that existed in relation to others, not the woman she had become through sacrifice and obligation, but something essential that lived beneath all of that. They returned to the restaurant shortly before midnight. Vincenzo walked her back inside, his hand never leaving her back. The dining room had mostly emptied. It was late for dinner, even in Naples. But their table was still occupied. Maria and Lucia were still there, along with their husbands, and the looks on their faces suggested that they had spent the entire evening consumed by speculation and fear. When Vincenzo and Teresa entered, Maria stood up, Robert following awkwardly behind her. There was an attempt at a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. The entire energy had shifted. Gone was the confidence, the arrogance, the casual cruelty. In its place was something that looked remarkably like dread. Vincenzo pulled out a chair for Teresa, and she sat back down at the table. He remained standing, one hand resting on the back of her chair. The restaurant owner appeared almost immediately with champagne, and the meal resumed, though everyone at the table understood that something fundamental had changed. The conversation was stilted now, careful. Maria attempted to engage Vincenzo in small talk, to establish some kind of connection or understanding. Robert excused himself to take a phone call and didn't return for 20 minutes. Lucia and Christopher seemed to understand that they were somehow implicated in something they didn't fully comprehend, and they lapsed into silence. And through it all, Vincenzo remained at Teresa's side. He ordered wine that he knew she would like, guided the conversation toward topics that would allow her to speak, made it clear through his proximity and his attention that she was the only person at the table whose presence he valued. After dinner, as they were preparing to leave, Vincenzo asked Maria and Lucia to walk with him to the parking area. Teresa watched as he spoke to them quietly, his voice never raising but his intention clear. Whatever he was saying created an immediate pallor in both women's faces. Whatever he was saying made Maria reach out as though to apologize, only to have her hand fall away, ineffective and rejected. When he returned to Teresa, his expression was unreadable. He took her hand and led her to a car that was waiting. A sleek black vehicle with darkened windows. The driver was already inside, the engine already running. "I am going to take you somewhere," Vincenzo said as he helped her into the back seat. "Somewhere private. And there, I'm going to tell you the truth about tonight, about why I came to that restaurant, about why everything changed the moment I saw you." The drive took them outside the city, away from the urban landscape toward the hills that surrounded Naples. The roads became quieter, darker, more solitary. Teresa should have been afraid. She knew in the rational part of her mind that she was placing herself in an extremely vulnerable position. She was alone with a man who was known, it was becoming increasingly clear, as a powerful and potentially dangerous figure. She was isolated, away from anything familiar. But fear was not what she felt. What she felt was anticipation, curiosity, and something else that she was only beginning to recognize as hope. The car eventually stopped in front of a villa, a sprawling structure of white stone and arched windows, built into the hillside overlooking the city below. Lights came on automatically as they approached, illuminating gardens that had been carefully cultivated and maintained. Inside, the villa was a study in understated elegance, all clean lines and neutral colors, expensive art on the walls, windows that seemed to frame views like carefully composed photographs. Vincenzo led her to a room at the back of the house, a kind of sitting room that opened onto a terrace overlooking Naples. The city sprawled below them like a circuit board, all lights and movement and human endeavor. They sat on a sofa that faced these windows, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Vincenzo began to talk. He told her that he had not come to the restaurant by chance. He had come because of her. 2 weeks earlier, one of his employees, a man named Paolo, had been eating at a small cafe in Boston when he had noticed a woman of a certain age, reading a book, sitting alone. There was something about her that had struck him, something that he couldn't quite articulate. He had taken a photograph without her knowledge, not in a malicious way, but in the way of someone who has been trained to notice things and to preserve the evidence of that noticing. He had shown the photograph to Vincenzo as a kind of joke, as a way of describing something ineffable that he had observed. And Vincenzo, for reasons he still didn't fully understand, had become obsessed. He had used his resources to investigate, to find out who she was, where she lived, what her life looked like. He had learned about the death of her sister, about the years she had spent raising her nieces, about the quiet and sacrificial life she had lived. And the more he learned, the more convinced he had become that this was a woman worth knowing, that beneath the sadness and the invisibility was someone of extraordinary value. So when he had learned that his nieces were planning a dinner in Naples, he had made arrangements to be there, not to intrude but to observe, to see with his own eyes whether the woman in the photograph was as remarkable as he had come to believe. "And when I saw you," he said, his voice low and intense, "I knew that all my instincts had been correct. You are remarkable, Teresa. Not because you are young or beautiful or conventionally successful. You are remarkable because you have lived with integrity and compassion in a world that does not always reward those things. You are remarkable because you love people who do not always deserve your love. You are remarkable because you exist." He reached over and took her hand. "I know that what I am telling you is strange, that it violates the normal way that people come to know each other. I know that you might be afraid of me, that you might think I am dangerous or unstable or some combination of both. And you are not wrong. I am a dangerous man, and my life has been unstable. But there is one thing I know with absolute certainty, and that is that the moment I saw you, something in me that had been broken began to heal." Teresa looked out at the city below, at the millions of lives being lived simultaneously, at the vast indifference of the world to the small dramas of individual hearts. She thought about the evening she had just lived through, about the cruel mockery that had preceded it, about the way that kindness was being offered to her now by someone the world considered dangerous. She turned to look at Vincenzo, and she saw in his eyes a question, a vulnerability, a kind of hope that mirrored her own. "My nieces," she said slowly. "What did you say to them?" His expression didn't change. "I told them," he said, "that the woman they had mocked was under my protection, that any further disrespect toward you would be considered a personal insult to me, that they should spend the rest of their lives grateful that they are still breathing, given what their casual cruelty might have warranted in another context." There was no anger in his voice as he said this, no particular emotion. It was stated as fact, as simply as he might have told her the temperature or the time. "Is that true?" she asked. "Are you really what they obviously think you are?" He considered this for a moment. "I am many things," he said finally. "Some of them illegal, some of them immoral. I have done things that would horrify you, Teresa. I have made choices that have hurt people. But I am also trying to become someone different, someone better. And I believe, I hope that meeting you is part of that transformation." Teresa felt something shift inside her, some fundamental reorientation of the way she understood the world. She had spent so long living according to the rules of kindness and propriety, had spent so long waiting for the world to recognize her worth, only to have that worth ignored by the people closest to her. And now, someone who operated outside the normal rules entirely was offering her something that she had never thought she would have. "I want to know you," she said quietly. "The real you, whatever that means." And Vincenzo leaned toward her, and for the first time, he kissed her. The weeks that followed Teresa's return to Boston existed in a kind of dream state, though one with increasingly solid edges. Vincenzo called her every evening at 7 o'clock, a consistency that was, she would come to understand, one of the fundamental aspects of his character. When he committed to something, he was absolutely reliable. She would answer the phone to find him on the other end, and they would talk until midnight or later, their conversations moving across the landscape of their lives, his childhood in Naples, her years raising her nieces, the small observations and large fears that constituted existence. He sent her books, literature in English and Italian, philosophy, history, poetry. He sent her flowers, but not the grand, impersonal arrangements that arrived from service providers. Instead, he sent specific bouquets chosen for particular reasons, accompanied by notes that made it clear he understood the significance of what he was giving and why. 3 weeks after the dinner in Naples, he appeared at her door in Boston. He had not told her he was coming. He had simply shown up on a gray November afternoon, standing on her brownstone steps in a charcoal coat, looking completely out of place and yet perfectly at ease. She had opened the door to find him there, and all the careful, rational arguments she had constructed about the improbability of their situation had collapsed into irrelevance. He stayed for a week. He did not attempt to push her toward anything she wasn't ready for. Instead, he learned her house, her neighborhood, her rhythms. He sat in her kitchen while she cooked and talked about her mother. He walked with her through the North End, and she showed him the places where she had grown up, the corner where she had played as a child, the church where her parents were married. He was present, attentive, genuinely interested in the geography of her life, and she learned during that week that his reputation was both more and less than she had imagined. He was indeed involved in organized crime, in ways that were complex and deep, but he was also someone trying to build something legitimate, someone struggling with the fact that his past was not something he could simply shed like an old coat. His men came to visit him. These were not hired thugs, but people with families, people with their own hopes and fears, people who had chosen loyalty to him because they believed in him. When he left Boston, he did so with the understanding that she would join him in Naples as soon as she could arrange it. She would take a leave of absence from her job. She taught art at a community center, a position that had never quite fulfilled her, but had always paid the bills. She would close up her house, she would begin a new chapter. But before she could leave, there was something that had to happen. Maria called her, and the tone of her voice was different than it had been since childhood. There was fear in it, yes, but also something else. Contrition, perhaps, or at least the recognition that something had shifted in the balance of power. She wanted to meet with Teresa, just the two of them. She said it was important. They met at a cafe in downtown Boston, on a cold December afternoon when the city was already decorated for the holidays. Maria was waiting at a corner table, and when she saw Teresa approach, she stood up, her movements uncertain, as though she was no longer entirely sure of the protocols of their relationship. They sat down, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Maria looked directly at her aunt for the first time in years. "I owe you an apology," Maria said. Her voice was quiet and steady. "And I know that an apology is insufficient for what we said about you, what I did to you." Teresa waited. "After that night at the restaurant, after Vincenzo left, he sent someone to speak to Robert," Maria continued. "They were very polite about it. They simply explained that certain kinds of behavior had consequences, and that my husband's financial dealings might become subject to investigation if I didn't understand the value of showing respect to someone Vincenzo cared about." She paused, her hands folded in front of her. "I was angry at first. I was angry that this man I had just met had threatened my life, my marriage, my security. But then I realized something. I realized that you had given me everything. Your time, your energy, your sacrifice, and I had repaid you with mockery. I had taken the fact that you loved me, and I had transformed it into a reason to despise you." The cafe around them was full of the ambient noise of other people's lives, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of conversation, the clink of cups. But in the space between them, there was a kind of quiet. "I want to know you," Maria said. "I want to know who you are outside of what you have done for me. And I want to apologize, sincerely and thoroughly, for all the years I failed to do that." Teresa felt something shift inside her, some long-held tension that she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten it was there. She reached across the table and took her niece's hand. "Tell me about your life," Teresa said. "Tell me what makes you happy. Tell me who you want to become." And Maria did. She talked about her marriage, which was less secure than Teresa had imagined. She talked about the pressure of maintaining a certain social position, the fear that underneath all the elegance and success, she was fundamentally empty. She talked about the fact that her mother, Teresa's sister, had wanted more for her than just money and status, but that she had somehow confused those things with the actual components of a meaningful life. Over the next few weeks, as Teresa prepared to leave Boston, She had similar conversations with Lucia. Both of her nieces seemed to be undergoing some kind of reckoning, some recognition of what they had lost in the pursuit of what they thought they wanted. And then, on a clear December morning, Teresa left Boston. She took a flight to Rome, then made her way to Naples. Vincenzo was waiting for her at the airport, and when she saw him, she felt the shock of recognition all over again. The fact that this man, this complicated, dangerous, powerful man, had chosen to see her, to value her, to transform her life through nothing more than his attention and his affection. He took her not to the villa in the hills but to a smaller house in the city itself, in a neighborhood that was quiet and residential, a place where she would not be isolated or set apart. It was decorated simply, carefully, as though he had been preparing it for her specifically. The weeks turned into months. She learned Italian, began to understand the rhythms of Neapolitan life, developed friendships in her neighborhood. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer forgotten. She was someone whose presence mattered, whose opinions were sought, whose love was returned measure for measure. Vincenzo continued to work, continued to navigate the complex world he inhabited, but increasingly he was building something legitimate. He invested in a non-profit organization dedicated to helping young people in Naples escape the pull of organized crime. He donated to cultural institutions, supported the arts, used his resources in ways that created beauty rather than destruction. And then, on a spring evening almost a year after they had met, he took her back to that restaurant where everything had changed. The owner greeted them personally, treating them with the kind of reverence typically reserved for royalty or saints. They were seated at the same table where she had sat a year ago, where she had felt the sting of mockery and mockery only, where she had believed that the trajectory of her life was fixed and unchangeable. Vincenzo stood up and took her hand, and in front of everyone in that restaurant, the tourists, the locals, the businessmen conducting their evening negotiations, he asked her to marry him. He didn't kneel, the way the synopsis suggested. Instead, he simply asked her, looking directly into her eyes, giving her the choice. "I do not want to be your destiny," he said. "I only want to be your choice. If you will have me, with all my complications and my past and my ongoing attempts to become someone better, I would like to spend the rest of my life with you." And Teresa, who had spent so long being unseen, who had waited so patiently for the world to recognize her worth, who had loved generously and received so little in return, said yes. The room erupted in applause, though Teresa barely heard it. She was focused only on the man in front of her, on the way he was looking at her, on the simple and profound fact that she was being truly seen, truly valued, truly loved. Her nieces were not present for the proposal, but they heard about it, through the networks of family connection that extended across oceans and time zones. And when Maria called her the next day, her voice was warm and proud and genuinely happy for her aunt in a way that it had never been before. "He proposed to you," Maria said, "in front of everyone." "He did," Teresa confirmed. "Do you love him?" Teresa considered the question carefully. Love, she had learned, was not a single emotion but a constellation of them. It was the feeling of being seen. It was the experience of being chosen. It was the knowledge that her sacrifices had value, that her patience had meaning, that her quiet goodness had resonated in the world in ways she couldn't have anticipated. "Yes," she said, "I do." As the seasons changed, as the wedding plans came together, as her life continued to unfold in ways that would have seemed impossible a year ago, Teresa would sometimes find herself thinking back to that night in Naples when everything had changed. She would think about her nieces, about the cruel words they had spoken, about the way that mockery had preceded kindness in her life. But she no longer felt anger. She understood finally that her value had never depended on other people's recognition of it. She had carried her worth inside herself all along, through all the years of sacrifice and invisibility, through all the moments when the world had suggested that she didn't matter. It had simply taken someone else seeing her to make her truly understand what she had always known, that a life lived with integrity and love, no matter how quiet, no matter how overlooked, was a life of profound significance. The pathetic old maid that her nieces had mocked was a queen, not because of the man she was marrying, though his love was part of her joy, but because she had finally accepted that she had always been worthy of being seen, worthy of being loved, worthy of a life that was full and meaningful and completely, utterly her own. Thank you for listening to the story of Teresa and Vincenzo. If this narrative of redemption, unexpected love, and transformation resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel. We create stories that remind us of the power of seeing one another, of the unexpected ways that life can unfold, and of the reality that our worth is not determined by what others think of us. Each week we bring you stories from around the world, stories of people who overcame adversity, who found love in the most unlikely places, who discovered that their lives held meaning in ways they never anticipated. Join our community of storytellers and listeners. Hit that subscribe button and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new chapter of human drama, resilience, and hope. Because everyone has a story, and everyone deserves to be heard.